carry on the scene in this neutral, third-person objective way. But what the reader who has the ability to pick up on Austen's irony knows is that actually the novel, doesn't want you to accept this thing that the narrator has said about Elizabeth Bennet, as the kind of authoritative, endorsed position of the novel. When we encounter this bit that reads, the refusal which his cousin had steadfastly given him would naturally flow from her bashful modesty and the genuine delicacy of her character. That is the thinking of Mr. Collins. That is what Mr. Collins is thinking, and the narrator is presenting it to us as though it were its endorsed opinion. But in fact, it's not. It's a penetration into the style of thinking of Mr. Collins. So often, free and direct discourse is used as an ironic tool, as a tool to heighten the irony. The irony is that while the narrator is presenting this to us as though it were an objective, endorsed opinion, we who understand irony know that that's not the case, that there's this sort of separation between what the narrative is asking us to believe and what the novel is asking us to believe, which is that Mr. Collins is a fool. Rather Elizabeth Bennet is not rejecting him out of bashful modesty or the genuine delicacy of her character. This is what Mr. Collins thinks, but it is not what the novel is inviting us to believe. So for us to pick up on this, we need to understand something like irony. Here's another example of free indirect discourse from a great modernist novel, which maybe some of you have read, which is Flaubert's Madame Bovary, one of the great modernist novels of all time. This is another example of free indirect discourse that isn't exactly ironic or funny, but what it is a sort of deep penetration into the thinking of the character. Okay, so this is from Flaubert. She repeated, "I have a lover, I have a lover," delighting at the idea as if a second puberty had come to her. So at last she was to know those joys of love, that fever of happiness of which she had despaired. She was entering upon a marvelous world where all would be passion, ecstasy, delirium. So what's sort of challenging about this is that we need to be able to separate between the narrative position, the narrative ideal, and the opinion and the point of view of the character. What's challenging about this is that free and direct discourse blends these two things, blends the narrative voice and blends the character the reflection. So that when the narrative gives us this idea that she was entering upon a marvelous world where all would be passion, ecstasy, delirium, that is from her point of view. She assumes that the act of taking a lover throws her into this world where all will be passion, ecstasy, and delirium. Which may or may not be the case, and in fact turns out, of course, not really to be the case for her. So that's another example of free and direct discourse, where the challenge it presents to us is to sort of to be able to discern where the narrative voice, which presents us with an objective view of the world, blends with a character's subjective point of view, without the benefit of quotation marks or those qualifying gestures that the third person omniscient narrator makes, saying things like he thought or she reflected or whatever. Like, there's a clear demarcation between now I am the narrator, now I'm representing the character's point of view. Instead, in free and direct discourse, we get a blending. So what does that have to do with this novel? Well, there are a bunch of examples of free and direct discourse that I've asked you to be on the lookout for, and we'll pick this up when we meet face to face next week. Looking at some examples of free and direct discourse. I've marked a bunch of them, and I sort of don't want to give all of them up. I want you to be able to do some of the work of discovery here too. And what I'm asking you to think about is the pattern. Is there a pattern that emerges in the novels, the moments in which the novel slips into a free and direct discursive style? Is there something that connects these moments of free and direct discourse? And if there is, what is the nature of that pattern? What do these moments of free and direct discourse have in common? And then related to that, what kind of reader is the narrative voice imagining? In Austen, I think that the kind of reader that the novel imagines is a reader who is capable of picking up on comic irony. We are not meant to endorse the point of view that is actually the point of view of Collins, that Elizabeth Bennet has rejected Mr. Collins because of her bashful modesty and the genuine delicacy of her character. It is less clear to me that we are able to separate the narrative point of view from that of the character with which the narrative point of view blends in these moments of free indirect discourse. I'm not sure that in this novel, free indirect discourse is a tool of irony. It's certainly not a tool of comedy, but I'm even less sure that it's a tool of irony. So I'm going to throw that out to you and ask you to reflect for next time on what is the effect of these moments of free indirect discourse. So I'm going to read a few moments in the novel that feature this thing called free indirect discourse, and then ask you to think, is there something that connects these things? Is there something that these moments have in common, right? Okay, so this is on page 7, and I'm going to read from 7 to... no, I'm just going to read from 8. I'm just going to read from around the top of page 8. There were several eating places, hamburger stands. There was a small drugstore, and there was a bar. He wanted a drink. It was a nice bar from the ship's prow that jutted upon the sidewalk to the dim ship's interior. It was a man's bar, although there was a dark-haired, squawk-voiced woman in it. She was with 2 men, and they were noisy. He didn't like them. But he liked the old man with the white chin whiskers behind the bar. The man had the quiet, competent air of a sea captain. He ordered straight rye, and when the old man set it in front of him, he didn't want it. He drank it neat, but he didn't want it. He hadn't needed a drink. He'd relax on the bus. He wasn't angry with anyone anymore, not even with the 3 noisy sons of bitches up front at the bar. So this is the narrative calling these noisy men at the bar noisy sons of bitches. Is it the narrator's point of view that these men are noisy sons of bitches, or is it Dix's point of view, or is it their mutual point of view? Well, this is a moment of free and direct discourse where the narrative voice and the internal thinking of Dix have melded. The narrator has presented this image of 3 noisy sons of bitches up at the bar as though it were its own neutral, objective value judgment on these men. It hasn't clearly discerned or distinguished itself from the point of view of Dix, but it is clear that this represents what Dix thinks of these men. So this is a moment in which Dix is registering his contempt for these people, and letting his anger sort of get the best of him. And what's challenging for us as readers is to dissociate ourselves from this point of view, because the narrator is presenting the point of view to us as though it were the endorsed objective point of view of the novel. We have to do a lot of kind of cognitive and imaginative labor to remind ourselves, no, this is actually the point of view of the narrative, not necessarily the point of view of the character. Let's see, another one. Here's another one on page 12, and these are maybe this will help, sort of fill in what I mean when I imply that there might be a pattern in these moments of free indirect discourse. This is halfway down the page 12. Sylvia uncapped his bottle, poured half into a tall frosted glass, and put it on an end table beside him. She brought Brub a bottle, poured a glass for herself. Her hands were lovely, slim and quiet and accurate. She moved quietly and with the same accuracy. She was probably a wonderful woman to bed with. No wasted motion, quietness. So, okay, so there's that. Now, let's see. Here's another one on page 36. I think I'll read this one, 2 more, and then call it. Okay. Sylvia spoke first. And who is Brucey, darling? This is going to be important, this question, who is Brucey? Who is Brucey, darling? She asks Brub. A girl we knew in England. She was a Red Cross worker when we were stationed near Dover. Scotch. That's where the Brucey came from. Cute as a button. Brub had noticed nothing, but he wasn't sure about Sylvia. Behind her civilized attention, her humor, her casualness, he wasn't certain. Something was there behind the curtain of her eyes, something in the way she looked at Dix, a look behind the look. She might have been watching him at that wrong moment. So there's one, and I want you to think about what's going on there. Here's one that, in a weird way, directly addresses the reader using the very rare narrative voice, the second person. There's a reference to you here. Okay, I'm reading from the top of 51. He didn't have to give up normal living. That had been his one mistake. Brub and Sylvia proved it. He could be with them and be himself and not give away any secrets. His nerves were steady, his eyes level. It was time to gather friends again. Someone besides Brub and Sylvia. He couldn't be so constant at their home. They might start wondering. Sometimes Sylvia's eyes were disturbing. They were so wise, as if she could see under the covering of a man. Ridiculous, of course. You didn't ever have to give yourself away, not if you were smart. So here I want you to reflect for next time on who is you? Who is this you? And in what way does this use of the second person you reinforce something that's happening, going on with this free indirect discourse? I think one of the things I'm trying to get at is that the free indirect discourse, which collapses the narrative point of view and the point of view of the character, also incorporates us as readers. It brings us into the consciousness of the character so that we are, in effect, inhabiting his point of view, which is a very dangerous game to be playing, a dangerous game for this novel to be playing, because what it is inviting us to do is share the perspective of a killer. We are given this kind of thing in Double Indemnity, both in the novel and the film. We're invited to share the point of view of Walter Neff, who is a murderer. I think the stakes are really raised, though, in this novel, because this novel features an active predator, a sex predator, a serial killer, and more even than that, the free and direct discourse really situates us in the mind of the character in a much more intense way than does the novel or the film Double Indemnity. Okay, I'm going to read one last one, and then I'm going to call it. This is on page 55. Somebody had put it on her finger, but there wasn't a wedding ring beside it. She answered coolly, "It's none of your business, son, but since you asked, not now." She lifted her chin, and he knew what she was about to say. He didn't want it said. He fended it away quickly. "You were a friend of Mel Terrace." Mel Terrace is the person whose house he's staying in. "The ring might have come from Terrace." "Not much." She stubbed her cigarette into the ashtray, dropped it on a couple of his parties. She eyed him. "You a friend of Mel's?" She was like all women, curious about your private life. He laughed at her. She'd find out only as much as he wished. An old friend, he laughed, pre-war, Princeton. Princeton meant money and social position to her. Calculation came that quickly under her skin. She was greedy and callous and a bitch, but she was fire, and a man needed fire. So let's pick up next time and think about what these moments of free indirect discourse have in common. Is there a pattern that emerges if we add them all up and think about what's connecting them? What is that pattern? And what are the implications of that pattern? In other words, what kind of reader is the narrative imagining? What kind of reader is the novel imagining? And are these things parallel? Are they identical? Or are they separate? Is there a way for us to pry ourselves away from the perspective of the character? Or does the free and direct discursive style of the novel actually force us to inhabit the mind of the character? And if so, what are the implications of that? So all kinds of questions that this novel is raising. I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to talk about it in person today, but we will next time. So come to class ready to go, because we've got a lot of work to do on this novel, because We've only got a couple of classes left. Okay, I'll see you all next week.